friends to the Armenian Bar Association webinar. This is the third in its series. We have tried in a series of programming to bring information about the legal aspects of what is happening in Artsakh and the rights and remedies for the people of Artsakh and Armenia. I am going to hand over the program to Anoush Baghdassarian, but I have to say a couple words about Anoush. Anoush is a 2L at Harvard Law School, and Anoush, since the beginning of the war, has had this very nervous energy about what can I do? How can I be most effective? And I have to tell you, she has been the bar's MVP. She has assembled a group of students and young lawyers who themselves organized and prepared a report. And we're going to hear quite a bit about the report today. But that was done on her initiative. And so oftentimes people look to senior seasoned lawyers to for direction. This time I have to tell you, we looked to Anoush for direction, and we're so glad that we did. So with that, Anoush, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I really appreciate it. And you know, although I know the bios are going to be in the chat, I have to give a brief introduction to the two really stellar professors we have here today. So Professor Sikkink is actually my professor from the Harvard Kennedy School, and she is the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and she works on international norms and institutions, transnational advocacy networks, and the impact of human rights law and policies and transitional justice. And again, the longer bios will be in the chat. And Professor McDougall is, I have the honor of meeting her tonight along with all of you. And she is a lawyer here in the US who has spent her career addressing international human rights and racial discrimination. And she is right now a distinguished scholar in residence at the Leitner Center on International Law and Justice at Fordham University Law School. And as a special treat for the topic we'll be talking about today, she served as Vice-Chairperson of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the CERD committee, one of the UN human rights treaty bodies that we'll be talking a lot about. So please read their bios in the chat because they are incredible, and we are so lucky to have them here with us today. So thank you both. And thank you everybody for being here in the audience. So to give a brief introduction, before we turn it over to the professors, I'll say that tonight we're here to talk about the international tools and treaties that exist to stop hate speech, violence, and discrimination against Artsakh's Armenians. However, the conversation will not solely revolve around Artsakh, as Armenians around the world have experienced an increase in hate crimes in the last few months. Nor will the conversation solely revolve around Armenians, as the dehumanizing rhetoric of the sort we have seen in this conflict has preceded ethnic cleansing in too many protracted conflicts around the world, long before this one. As I often say, it is not history that repeats itself, but rather people who repeatedly fall into the same psychological cycles that lead to reactions history has seen before. So by understanding the human mind and individual actors as historical agents of ethnic cleansing, we can get closer to understanding the patterns that precede such extreme violence across cultures, regions, and time periods. It is our inability often to effectively address the warning signs that allows ethnic cleansing to continue to occur, but today we will discuss the international tools and mechanisms that have been put in place to address just that, to address the warning signs before they escalate into large-scale atrocity. And one of those warning signs and patterns that precedes ethnic cleansing is dehumanizing rhetoric. In Rwanda, propaganda filled with euphemistic labeling and dehumanization was greatly prominent preceding the genocide. Over the radio, the Rwandan president and his close colleagues broadcast sessions calling the Tutsis cockroaches and saying they were interlopers who had unfairly benefited from Belgian rule. When the Soviet Union was committing mass murder on its own citizens, the target group was categorized as pariahs, untouchables, vermin, and looked down upon as cattle, swine, loathsome, and repulsive. And then propaganda from the Khmer Rouge included newspaper articles titled "Clean up all the parasites" and slogans such as "Down with the monsters and demons" everywhere on posters, official newspapers, and in rallying cries. More modernly, in the current conflict with Azerbaijan, the dehumanizing rhetoric from official levels of government and the incitement to violence from the most senior officials includes calling Armenians cancer tumors, dogs, and calling for their death. Most recently, Azerbaijan released official stamps demonstrating the cleansing they did of the Nagorno-Karabakh region. The physical hate acts instigated around the world from Moscow to San Francisco to Lyon include Azerbaijani and Turkish diasporans vandalizing Armenian monuments, burning Armenian institutions, and terrorizing Armenians by driving through the streets yelling from their cars that Armenians should come out from hiding. Furthermore, the appearance of the gray wolf symbol, akin to white supremacist signs or other symbols inciting hatred or violence, has grown more prominent at these violent global protests, instilling fear in many Armenians around the world of the systematic animosity harbored against them. Yet, as I mentioned earlier, there are international tools and mechanisms that exist to combat such dehumanizing rhetoric and help prevent them from escalating to the most harmful scales. And one of those is the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, also known as the CERD. The CERD is a body of independent experts that monitors state parties' compliance with the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And all states parties are obliged to submit regular reports to the committee on how the rights of the convention are being implemented and adhered to. The committee examines each report and addresses its concerns and recommendations to the state party in the form of concluding observations. And civil society members can also comment on a state party's adherence to international conventions through submitting alternative reports. I have to thank Professor Sikkink for introducing me more deeply to the workings of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in her global governance class last semester at Harvard. It was there that I was inspired to bring together a group of bright Armenian law students and recent graduates from around the world to draft an alternative report to the committee detailing Azerbaijan's violations of this convention in just the last few months. The Armenian Bar Association embraced the initiative and submitted this report late last year for Azerbaijan's upcoming review before the CERD. The almost 40-page report discusses Azerbaijan's violations of its obligations under the convention and focuses on Azerbaijan's policies of racial discrimination against ethnic Armenians. As detailed in the report, despite several international human rights organizations, including the CERD, having expressed concern about Azerbaijan's policies of racial discrimination against ethnic Armenians, Azerbaijan has not only failed to end these policies of racial discrimination against ethnic Armenians, but rather has exacerbated them during its recent military action against the predominantly Armenian-populated Republic of Artsakh and the Republic of Armenia. The report lists and documents Azerbaijan's hate speech and racially motivated hate crimes, which lead to the conclusion that Azerbaijan has not eliminated the problems highlighted in the CERD's concluding observations of 2016 and has not implemented their recommendations from the last review, but instead has reinforced its policies of racial hatred and discrimination against ethnic Armenians. Such policies resulted in the most profound and severe expressions of Armenophobia and anti-Armenian sentiment in Azerbaijan during and after its military campaign in Nagorno-Karabakh, which manifested as physical harm, including torture and the death of ethnic Armenians, destruction and vandalism of Armenian property and cultural heritage, and the violation of Armenians' environmental rights. The report concludes by requesting that the CERD urge Azerbaijan to end impunity for its anti-Armenian policies, investigate each stance of hate speech and hate crimes against ethnic Armenians under the control of Azerbaijan and its forces, and implement steps to curtail such anti-Armenian policies immediately. Submitting reports like this to the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination is just one way to tap into the existing arsenal of mechanisms that exist to combat and prevent such discriminatory actions. We are privileged today to be joined by two experts, Professor Sikkink and Professor McDougall, who have dedicated their careers both in practice and academia to understanding and utilizing the international tools that exist to prevent human rights abuses like these. So, without further ado, let's move into hearing from them. Professor Sikkink, you are an expert on international norms and institutions, transnational advocacy networks, and the impact of human rights law and policies. might you be able to explain a bit more to us about the importance of treaties like the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination that codify international norms, and also the efficacy of the institutions like the CERD that work to enforce them?
Thank you, Anoush, for this invitation to speak, and welcome to all the participants. First, I have to say that having had Anoush in my class, I'm not at all surprised to learn that you've been the moving force behind this report. I also want to clarify that Professor McDougall, who will speak shortly, is the real expert here on CERD committee, but I'm a social scientist, I'm a political scientist, and I've done research on the effectiveness of human rights law, institutions, and movements. And really about for the last 15 years, social scientists have begun trying to say, can we find any way to measure whether these institutions are effective or not? And a variety of different authors and have used qualitative and even quantitative methods to try to explore their effectiveness. And I wanted to just briefly mention a book by one of my former colleagues at Harvard, Beth Simmons, called Mobilizing for Human Rights, where she does qualitative and quantitative look at human rights law. And she discovers that countries that have ratified a variety of human rights treaties actually end up having better human rights practices as a result of ratifying those treaties. And so, for example, countries that have ratified the CEDAW Convention, the Women's Convention, see concrete results compared to countries that have not. More girls are likely to continue longer in school as compared to boys in countries that have ratified the Women's Convention, for example. Now, there is not the same kind of research for the CERD, and I think in part that's because issues like racial discrimination, ethnic discrimination, hate speech are harder to measure when we're trying to look at change over time. And I mean, Anoush has done an excellent job of describing the kinds of hate speech that you see, that we've seen in different countries and that you see specifically right now in Azerbaijan. But it's very difficult to know what impact law is having on that. And so I wanted to also say that, and since I think almost everyone in the room is a lawyer, you know that law also moves slowly and legal mechanisms move slowly. And so we have concerns that with such a emergency situation, really, as we see today, that law may be slow in dealing with it. And so I wanted to say that findings by authors like Beth Simmons and some of my own work has shown, it's not that you just ratify a treaty and change happens. Change happens because treaties are tools, and those tools have to be used. They have to be used by civil society groups. They have to be used by other governments in order to activate law and allow treaties to make a difference. And so, one big question, and this is why it's so important that Anoush and others are beginning to use the tools that are made available by these treaties, in this case, the ability to submit these shadow reports, because that's how the law is activated, and that's how it can have an impact. But I know we'll hear from Professor McDougall many other ways that people can make use of these treaty bodies.
Professor McDougall, thank you, Professor Sikkink. Professor McDougall, building off of that, I mean, you were the vice chair of the co-vice chair of the CERD, and you also were the first UN independent expert on minority issues, and so you certainly have thoughts, I'm sure, about why the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination is important, and just generally, I'm wondering if you could please share with us what, in your opinion, is the importance of combating racial discrimination that comes from the highest levels of society, and maybe some examples in which you've worked for different minority communities experiencing such discrimination throughout your career. But first, maybe about the importance of this work that you've dedicated so much of your life to.
Well, first of all, let me say that it's wonderful to have been invited by a Harvard student, a law student, to this webinar, and to also share the platform, if you will, with the professor who has done work in a different field, which I think that we would really benefit from hearing more about at the UN, because we have a problem, obviously, in evaluating our effectiveness. And I would say that one of the things that is interesting or useful about CERD, as opposed to some of the other treaty bodies, is that it's not a treaty body that has a majority of lawyers on it.
Mm-hmm.
So people come from different perspectives on, to sit on the committee, and I think it has benefited it. But I think across the board, the human rights mechanisms in Geneva, as opposed to those that are in New York or the Peace and Security Wing, do need to think more, and the thinking needs to come to us about how we could be more effective and how what we do could be more effective. So that's one point. But I do want to say, Anoush, I want to celebrate you on the quality of the report that you put together. It is absolutely, very, very, very useful and comprehensive. But okay.
It was a team effort. Thank you. It was a big team effort, but thank you so much. That goes out to the team, everyone, if you're watching. So thank you, Professor McDougall.
I would say that something's going on here. I would say that first of all, the rule against racial discrimination is one of the oldest laws, international laws, customary laws of international law. And it's ranked at the top of the hierarchy. So, that's one thing. Presumably, there can be no derogation from it. And that existed before the codification into the International Convention. But I think that the convention is important because we routinely have discussions with states about the extent to which they have implemented the provisions of CERD. And our discussions are quite lengthy, and we try to, in a friendly manner, explore with the governments why these rules are important to a society being successful as a whole. I think nothing breaks down a society more than discrimination based on minority groups, based on race, based on religion. And the thing that I think is worth thinking about, and I've been thinking about it very much in terms of my own society here in the US, is not why do people use hate speech, is why it's effective. And it is. It's sort of like running a dirty campaign for election seems to be effective. So there are other things that are happening in a society that makes people open to taking out their anger. Once bad leaders decide that they're going to use hate speech in order to deflect attention, to target a scapegoat, to deflect attention, etc. And it has terrible consequences. Just think about 2 weeks ago and what happened in Washington as those mobs stormed the Capitol. And it had been coming. People pointed their fingers. This is wrong. It's going to happen. It's a bad thing to happen. But for the president at the time, it was useful in deflecting attention, in whipping up a reason for a scapegoat, reason for his loss of the election, and of, you're in the U.S. So, that's the other thing. We can't just talk about hate speech. We got to talk about what is it that's going on in the minds of those who hear it that make them react in the way that they do and become instruments of, those that are creating the hate speech. So, I'm constantly amazed at the degree to which this document that was written and adopted in 1969 still is quite relevant. And it speaks to almost every situation that at least has been brought before CERD in the last 10 years, including the flows of new migrants from the global south to global north, including the George Floyd situation and the Charlottesville situation and Syria, et cetera, et cetera. Now, our handicap as a treaty body is that we can only identify problems, violations of the convention, and to not only see the facts, but also to say this is a violation of an obligation that the country involved has taken on willingly under international law. But we do it routinely. So, a lot of groups come to us and say, well, stop this. We can't stop it. We don't have those tools. But we speak to others who have better tools than we do. We speak to the General Assembly. The General Assembly can speak to the Security Council, and the Security Council can, for example, impose sanctions of various kind. Now, that doesn't always happen. I started my career at the UN around South Africa. Actually, before South Africa was successful, we were knocking at the door trying to get it to be. So I have seen a situation in which the UN and the international community were positioned to play the best role they can play. And that has given me the impetus to keep going. We can win, but it's not easy. Yeah.
Thanks. Professor Sikkink, did you want to add something? Otherwise.
I actually wanted to ask a question, and that had to do with individual petition under CERD. And I wanted to ask Professor McDougall if she could say, so I looked and I saw that Azerbaijan has accepted individual petition. And and also the CERD has a unique wording where it's individual petition and groups of individuals, which some of the other human rights treaties don't have. And I wonder if you could say anything about whether that could be used in this circumstance, and would that be another good route to go beyond the report that Anoush and her group have already done?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of things that I would suggest. Yes, individual petitions can be put before CERD, claiming injury to specific individuals or groups. I don't know if there's ever been a group petition, but the one thing is individuals can be represented by somebody like Anoush, which helps a lot. Unfortunately, CERD has not had as much practice with individual petitions as, for example, the Committee on Civil and Political Rights, which has had a greater deal of practice. And actually, I was going to say, the one thing that you have to be ready to do, you need to engage all of the mechanisms, because in the end, it's that consensus that you need to build. You build it slowly, but you got to go to every treaty body that's relevant. So there's the Committee on Civil and Political Rights under Article 27, the Committee on the Rights of the Child under its Article 30. You've got to go to all of the CEDAW. This situation touches all of those and more. So you want to get all of them active around this matter. The other thing is that that CERD has two unique possibilities for you. One is that we have an early warning urgent action procedure, which says, look, if in this case, it would be if Azerbaijan is not coming up for anytime soon for review under the routine review. And a situation is occurring or emerging that is urgent and that would lead to a greater damage or irreparable harm, etc., then you bring that to the committee immediately and to the urgent action procedure working group, and CERD will be able to take it up and either issue a statement if it demands something that is immediate media ready, or a more important and considered decision. So that can be a range of things. I can think of a number of situations that you mentioned actually in your report that could be brought immediately to CERD under the urgent action early warning procedure. And, you know, during this time when the mechanism to review country reports is shut down because of the pandemic, it's important to see whether or not they are still considering urgent action procedures. So that's another. So there are individual complaints. There's the urgent action. Here's the other one that's really very interesting and has been sort of hiding for most of the lifetime of the convention. And that is that under Articles 11 to 13, there is a procedure called Interstate Communications. And this is unique among the treaties, except for maybe the Genocide Convention. Unlike the individual petition proceeding where the country has to have separately accepted the jurisdiction, this, no, not at all. Any state party to the convention can bring a communication, call it a petition, whatever you, but it's more broader than an individual. Any state brings it against another state and says that that second state is not abiding by the requirements of the convention, is violating the basic tenets and requirements, what have you, of the convention. And you know, in 2019, we had the first ever such petitions, and they all came at the same time. They came from Qatar against the UAE, that was one, and also Qatar separately against Saudi Arabia. And then there was a petition filed by the state of Palestine against Israel. And what happens is that there is a decision that must be made by the committee on jurisdiction and whether or not it broadly falls, the matter falls within the provisions of the convention. You don't need to, there's no exhaustion really of domestic remedies. But if the state passes the initial phase, then a conciliatory process begins. And so CERD would establish a commission of to lead this conciliatory process and to investigate the facts on the ground and try to gain some sort of agreement between the states on how the respondent state is going to bring itself into compliance with the I'm having trouble here. I'm sorry, I'm struggling a little. Into compliance with the convention on the ground, as it is, on the ground, and then CERD would follow those actions to the point of guaranteeing that the respondent state brings its position into compliance. Now, so far, none of the complaints have gone fully through conciliation. But that is a factor, first of all, of the pandemic having, created a sort of lockdown on the process. But it's been very difficult for CERD because, this being the first of this process, being the first time that this provision has been used ever, has meant that we have had to devise the procedures step by step and figure out how to do it in a way that is considered both fair to the leading state and the respondent state. But it has been very interesting. Both states get to argue the cases. There is an exchange, of course, of briefs back and forth and arguments. And we don't know how the conciliation will proceed in any of the cases. I think that the reality would be in the case of Palestine versus Israel, that the respondent state in that situation will refuse to go into the conciliation. And so we'd have to figure out how to deal with that.
Thank you.
So, this is a possibility that I think ought to be considered, because Armenia could bring the action, state against state.
Thank you, Professor McDougall. Yeah, go ahead, Professor Sikkink.
I have a question for you, Anoush, now, actually.
Okay.
And that is, given what we've heard from Professor McDougall about these two options, about individual and group complaint option, and now the interstate, do you or maybe other members of the Armenian Bar Association have any information about whether are individuals already submitting complaints to CERD? Are groups of individuals possible? Could a group submit complaints? Could the Armenian Bar Association be one of those groups that could submit complaints, for example? And do you know anything at all whether the Armenian government would be interested in one of these interstate complaints?
Let me just say this. I think that the group that is the complainant has to be itself injured. A group of the injured parties.
Okay.
So I've been looking into that, and I've been working just looking into the individual complaint per se, and I've been talking to people on the ground, and I've seen actually that Professor McDougall, you said you're not sure if the CERD has received complaints from groups, and I have seen it, and so that exists, and I think that's definitely a viable option. That, as you said, Professor McDougall, even a law student like me or anyone here could help facilitate that and bring that. So that's definitely an area that I think is worthy to look into, and that I have started moving my gaze towards, but also, state to state complaint, that's actually a very interesting process, and I know that the MFA of the Republic of Armenia has formally called on Azerbaijan to comply with its international obligations under the convention, and I think they're waiting through the period now that is the requisite period for a response. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure if they're taking advantage of the state-to-state function there.
No, they have not.
Okay, so that's a
That
great.
I know.
Okay, yeah, that's a great idea, and something that definitely should be looked into. And but on these different functions of the CERD, it seems like, as you said, the CERD has a lot of unique functions that other treaty bodies don't have. And so I'm curious to both of you, actually, in your studies and in your experiences, while it's hard to prove a counterfactual, Professor McDougall, you said that this kind of action keeps happening, and this discrimination is not, and hate speech is not going to go away, and it's been around for history, and it's before it was even codified, it was in customary international law. And so I'm curious to both of you, have you seen, with the functions that the CERD has, have you seen it be effective in stopping this kind of speech or action before it becomes ethnic cleansing? And Professor Sikkink, I think you had perhaps some examples about the Roma people, and Professor McDougall, you were alluding to South Africa earlier, but perhaps you'd like to share that example or another. But I'm just curious, how effective do you feel the CERD has been? And it's great that there are now new ways to tap into the functions of the CERD, and that's fantastic for lawyers to think creatively and do cases of first impression, and that's exciting to a law student like me. But I'm just curious, in your experience thus far and in your studies, has it been effective? What is this tool serving? What purpose is it serving in its efficacy?
I would say first that I want to very much agree with Professor McDougall when she says it's important to not only do one thing. It's important for these groups in civil society, for victims organizations and other groups, to try a range of options, because I think what matters is by raising the level of awareness of the issue. And you can do that through a variety of different, and sometimes you don't know which one's going to work, because sometimes it has to do sort of with what catches the attention of the media, for example, what catches the attention of other foreign governments that start to talk about it, and then that will bring more pressure to bear. And I just have to say, I'm reading the question and answer period, and I want to say there's a colleague here from Juan Pablo Artinian who says, hello from Buenos Aires, congrats to my former student Anoush, best Juan Pablo Artinian. Well, I wanted to say the Argentines, since we have an example, were very good at this during the Argentine dictatorship, and that is they were very good at using multiple arenas for action. So the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, for example, but also the human rights, what's then called the UN Human Rights Commission. And they were also very good when they got stymied at one point to kind of finding a response. So originally they wanted the Human Rights Commission to look at the case of Argentina. When that was blocked by the Argentine government, they were able to promote setting up the first ever working group on disappearances. And because it wasn't just about Argentina, the Argentines didn't block it. And that was the genesis of what we now think of as these very obvious, working groups as part of the Human Rights Council. So, anyway, I wanted to suggest that, and my hunch is that the use of this interstate procedure, because it's so new, it will capture more attention. And so a question I want to put to some members of our audience as well is, presumably it's the foreign ministry, the Armenian foreign ministry that makes this decision, right, to bring forward an interstate
Yes.
An interstate complaint of this sorts. And so I'd be interested in knowing what any members of the audience know or think about whether the Armenian foreign ministry this would be something they would take up or not.
And to that also, Professor McDougall, I know I asked also for an additional comment on the last question, but I'm just curious, you said, it goes to this, I believe you said, was it called a reconciliation period, or I'm not sure what conciliation period?
A conciliation.
Conciliation. So what are the negatives of that kind of period? Why would a state not want to engage in that? And or if Armenia does bring that, what could something negative be a consequence to Armenia?
Well, look, why would any state not want to be a part of the conciliatory process? It would be Azerbaijan. Feels that they're not going to, there's nothing that they have to, talk about here. They've done nothing wrong. They're not going to, go into a conciliatory process. They have their rights. That unfortunately is what is, possibly going to stop it. But by that time, CERD will have amassed a large amount of facts about what would be going on the ground, which would be necessary for the case to be put forward, and would have made these recommendations around the process, and it would be costly politically for a state to walk away from that. I mean, throughout all of this, you have to calculate the cost to a state for not participating in the process, for not appearing to be reasonable. So that will be the other side. Now, some states, in the Palestine versus Israel, interstate communication, Israel claimed from the beginning that it didn't recognize Palestine as a state. So they were not willing to be in the same room with Palestine. They changed their minds after, because Palestine did come, of course, and made its case in a very effective way. And a state should miss that opportunity to speak its own case. So I just want to come back to a point that the professor made here, though.
I'm sure she'll join again. We lost Professor McDougall. When she comes back, she can continue answering that question. But until then, Professor Sikkink, I wanted to ask you about, I know we learned in your class about disinformation versus misinformation. And I'm thinking, if there were some type of conciliatory process or something, I'm sure, undoubtedly, of course, Azerbaijan would want to make their case. But a lot of what's coming out of their media sources are constituted of disinformation. And I'm curious, how a conciliatory process would, or just any type of process would weigh those facts, or how you think we can, as Armenians, try to get around that or make sure the true facts are seen. I've been I've been trying to figure out, is there a way to get a neutral commission on the ground? And I know many others are thinking of that as well. And so I don't know if you have a thought on how to combat that.
Right. Well, first I have a question. So I hope that when Professor McDougall comes back, when she said a conciliation, I think a conciliation process, I was thinking maybe she didn't mean a conciliatory, but rather conciliation, is one of the forms of arbitration. It's more of it's an old style word, but it does sometimes refer to a third party. Conciliation is one of those arbitration things where you have a neutral third party being asked to make some kind of decisions. And if that's the case, if the CERD is being asked to conciliate, not in the sense of bring people together and have them, all agree, but rather emit some kind of third party decision. She did say that CERD would have gathered facts on the ground. It seems to me that CERD may be your tool to get a less biased information, and that would make this a good process to pursue.
And if let's say that is not the tool, or for some reason that doesn't go forward, do you have other suggestions or ideas of how to combat that kind of disinformation if a neutral body does not go to the ground?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, so human rights NGOs. So my question is, normally these larger human rights NGOs do send fact-finding groups in, and so I'd be curious what's happening with groups like Human Rights Watch, what's happening with Amnesty International, some of these other groups.
Hello.
Hi, welcome back. And I do think that the European Court of Human Rights would be another issue that should be taken up, or something within the Council of Europe where they're both members.
Thank you. Professor McDougall, we had another question for you as you were gone, but if you wanted to finish your train of thought of you were speaking of, do you remember?
Yeah, just this point, I hope I get through this one, is that in charting a strategy, you have to consider, think of being in a big room with all the players. Every one of them has their own self-interest. And it's important to identify and to think about what is in the self-interest of each of the countries around the table. And you have to tiptoe around those or find a way to speak to their interests. So, for example, over the summer, as we were trying to get effective action on against the police killing of George Floyd, and particularly the attacks on the protesters, the peaceful protesters, we had to be mindful of the fact that, and we were trying before the Council on Human Rights, we have to be mindful of the fact that many of the countries represented in the Council were attacking protesters in their own countries at the time. And so how do we play that? Those are the kinds of things you have to think about as you think about genocide. The other thing is that on genocide, ethnic cleansing and genocide, these are the two of the issues that are dealt with primarily in New York by as part of the issues of international peace and security. And there is a special advisor to the Secretary General on genocide, and one on the duty to protect, the duty of states to protect. And these are the two that take the front, the lead of the UN, along with states, but of trying to get states to take effective action when they see, hate speech that would be pulling a country into ethnic cleansing, genocide, etc. So it would be important to talk to them. I would imagine that they are fully engaged already on this question. You may not know what they're doing because in their mandate to try to move member states to do, various things, sometimes it's in their interest for it to be not totally confidential, but nevertheless something that is not the grist of media until the action actually happens. But you need to find a way to put your case before.
Oh, I think you got muted, Professor McDougall. Still muted. Not yet. Okay. Oh, did that
Okay.
work? There you go.
So you need to try to get before those two special advisors to the Secretary General. And in doing already on this matter, I'm sure that they are engaged in some way.
Thank you. We had one question for you when you briefly were gone about the conciliation. And it was about, you said that perhaps they send a neutral fact-finding mission or some type of body to collect facts. And we were talking about the disinformation that is really rampant in this conflict. And so I and others have been thinking about other ways to get neutral commissions on the ground to collect facts. But I wonder actually if Professor Sikkink said, maybe this is the mode, this is maybe the method to get a neutral fact-finding body on the ground. But I'm curious what you think of that and how this committee would go about combing through the disinformation and finding the facts, and if this is, you think, an appropriate method, and if there might be any obstacles for Armenia to have that kind of body on the ground coming from Azerbaijan. Can the other country stop and hinder any of these initiatives, particularly if the territory is internationally recognized as under their control?
Yes, they can stop it. In fact, every special rapporteur has to deal with the fly in the ointment, which is that the country of concern that you want to go to and to investigate has a right to say, no, you cannot come on my territory. And so that's a problem. And generally what is done then is that the fact finders go to a frontline state that is itself neutral, and then interviews refugees or people who might come across the borders, etc. But as a nonstop fact-finding capacity that has been developed with respect to nearly every state of concern. And it goes 24/7. And so I think that generally they wind up with an ability to deal well with picking through misinformation campaigns. But it is unfortunate that when there is a country that is in crisis and needs help, it's that country that can say, oh no, you can't come here.
Thank you. Maybe we can move into the Q&A in the I see Professor Sikkink, you've been answering some of them by typing. I'm curious, maybe we can choose one from the anonymous attendee. Professor Sikkink, I know we learned about the responsibility to protect in your class, and Professor McDougall, I think that's what you were just referencing as well. And so the anonymous attendee says, how can we invoke the UN's responsibility to protect regarding hate speech when the UN did not exercise their responsibility to protect when Azerbaijan, Turkey, and terrorists attacked Armenians, including civilians? How can the UN be forced to protect? Is this the UN's duty? Is the UN's duty legally binding? So as one way to answer it.
Professor, do you want to take that?
Professor Sikkink, you're muted.
I'm muted. No.
The first thing we should say is the responsibility to protect is a set of norms or soft law that partly restates things that are already part of hard law. For example, it says if there's going to be in the final part of responsibility to protect is if everything else has failed and you might decide to have a military intervention, it can only happen through the Security Council. Okay, and so I think that responsibility to protect is not much help here. Because Pillar 1 says first, we point out to the state that it has responsibility. Secondly, the international community tries to help that state fulfill its responsibility. And third, if all else fails, you may choose sanctions. But those sanctions legally have to be through the Security Council. Okay, and I don't know the situation here, but I think it's possible that one member of the Security Council will veto that. So that's a good question. What do you think, Gay, or what do you think, Anoush? Do you think that the Security Council would go ahead with some kind of intervention in this situation?
Well, I mean, look, Russia would veto, wouldn't it?
In my opinion, yes. Russia tries, and from what I've seen and understood, to remain neutral between the two. So supporting something would be taking a side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but they would veto.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You also have certain countries like China that veto everything that might involve any kind of not just military intervention, but also in many situations, political intervention. So what the special advisor on the duty to protect and the special advisor in genocide wind up doing when most of their time is analyzing the situation. And to the extent that they can move quickly enough to get to the principal actors to talk to them, to talk to other sources of power within the country under concern. And to talk to governments that might have influence on the country of concern, let's say. But, that's what the UN does. If it cannot, as it generally is not able to call out troops.
Mm-hmm.
Troops go out generally after the fighting, at the point when there is a truce, and the troops are to try to monitor the truce.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor McDougall and Professor Sikkink. I wanted to, again, pick up on a question with which Professor Sikkink you might have particular knowledge about, but also Professor McDougall, you might have ideas too. My professor from Argentina wrote that, in South America, or in Argentina per se, they have the derecho a la verdad, the right to the truth. And that's actually the law, I believe, that Argentina was able to recognize the genocide with, by saying the Armenians have the right to the truth, to know where their ancestors' bodies were buried. Sorry, we can't give you that truth because they were killed in genocide. And so I think, and please, Professor, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the way Argentina ended up recognizing the Armenian genocide. And so the professor is asking if there's a way we can apply some type of right to the truth to the Armenian case. I don't know if he's asking it in Argentina or in the world, but do either of you have thoughts on that?
Well, one, I think it's a great suggestion. And I'm happy to see here that your professor teaches at Ditela University in Buenos Aires, which is where I taught when I was a visitor, a Fulbright in Argentina. But as I think Juan Pablo knows, the right to truth in Latin America has not been generally received in the rest of international law. And so when we talk about, so I think it would be harder in international law where the right to truth is not yet incorporated. So there's a now strong movement in the world to have transitional justice, including truth commissions, okay? And those truth commissions can be seen as the type of remedy that international law does call for remedies when there's breaches. But I don't think that the right to truth is as well embodied in the rest of international law as it is in Argentina in particular and Latin America more generally.
Okay, I want to ask this question about Lucy's question, which is long, about Armenophobia. And she says, Armenophobia is a serious issue, not only in Azerbaijan, but also elsewhere in the world. Just today, there was a case when a professor who identifies himself as Iranian, likely to be Iranian Azeri, had questioned a student about spelling his name at Vanier College in Montreal, Canada. Acts of Armenophobia, big and small, occur everywhere in the world. And what can the US do to prevent such acts? Another example is that Facebook banned the denial of the Holocaust, but not the denial of other genocides, including the Armenian genocide. So do you think it's time for the American government to, she says, be brave and act in favor of justice? So maybe to make the question more broad, it's, how can we engage the American government? If either of you have suggestions of how to get governments, and particularly the American government, to take action. Is it through lobbying? What are your suggestions?
Well, first I wanted to say that I think it, I think that the Facebook banning the denial of the Holocaust took a lot of pressure and lobbying. I don't know the campaign behind it, but I can imagine what it was. But that Facebook has been coming around lately with what's happened in the United States, and they were very, very much an organization committed to kind of free speech no matter what. They were not a group that was accepting notions of lies and hate speech, but they may be more amenable to that now. And a good place to start was to say, you've denied the you banned the denial of Holocaust, you need to move on to these other well-documented, well-accepted examples of genocide, and the Armenian one would be, would be a very important next step for them. So I think that's a campaign worth engaging in with Facebook, okay? In terms of the US government, I'm working on a piece right now for Foreign Affairs about what should be the human rights policy of the Biden administration. And to tell the truth, the first thing I'm saying is that the US government, in order to have an adequate global human rights policy, the US government has to get its own house in order. Okay, so I think people are going to have to the United States government is not going to immediately be able to return to a position of leadership in the world. It's been, for one thing, its reputation has been very tarnished by the Trump administration. But secondly, the Biden administration has a big domestic agenda, and it needs to start working on its domestic human rights issues. And then to be able to use that from a position of greater strength to be able to also engage internationally. Okay, so yes, I do think the American government needs to be brave, but I think its first brave acts need to be to confront its own domestic racism and structural injustice in order to be able to speak with any credibility internationally.
I agree 100%. But I do think it might be possible to get a statement from Biden, which usually, in these circumstances, winds up being, one sentence or a mention in a speech at the appropriate time. If you keep knocking at that door, I think you could get that. But as to much more, I think, it will take, absolutely right. The US has a lot to do to make its word one that is listened to internationally. And right now, the US has no representative on any of the treaty bodies because Trump fired us all and refused to replace. And it had pulled out of the Human Rights Council, threatened to defund it. I mean, he just trampled all over everything. And so, I think there's a lot to be done before, is going to be able to take on bigger issues and actually get something done. But I do think that you can get Biden to include, or the Secretary of State, to include a mention of Armenian genocide in some appropriate speech. It won't be a speech about Armenia, but it will be, for example, there is an annual day. I think it just occurred, so, but you would need a year to work on this, of recognition of victims of genocide. That's the time when you could get a mention in the speech that either the ambassador to the UN or the Secretary of State makes, commemorating that.
And just to add to that, the current Secretary of State confirmed today, Blinken, he said he has made statements already, and it's good to continue to push for more. But just to emphasize what Professor McDougall just said, he made statements reiterating Biden's pledge to the recognizing the genocide, but then also made a statement saying that the administration will reinvigorate U.S. engagement to find a permanent settlement to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict that protects the security of Nagorno-Karabakh. So it's not exactly as concrete as, of course, many of us would like it to specifically mention Armenians, but it is in his rhetoric, at least so far.
I just want to ask one quick question, though, to Professor McDougall. So I knew about U.S. disengagement in the Human Rights Council. I didn't realize that literally they had fired all the experts on the treaty bodies.
Well, they have not. Well, let me put it this way. I was not allowed to go forward. At the time, I would have been just rolled over. And my name was put forward by the State Department, which surprised me. But the White House blocked it and did not put forward anybody else. In fact, they blocked it at a time when it was too late to put forward any other name. I'm not sure what has happened with Kat. You see, the other thing is that we're only members of 3 treaties.
Right.
And something, I'm not sure exactly what happened with Kat, but nobody's there. And I think they put a candidate up for the Committee on Civil and Political Rights, maybe it was Kat, who lost the election. And that's kind of unheard of, that the American candidate loses an election. But the respect for Trump was at such a low level, and in going low, it took the whole the respect for the U.S. Government, as well as allowing a gaping hole in the fabric that holds respect for human rights together. So yes, there's nobody on those treaty bodies that is American. The U.S. is not in the UN, in the Council. As you know, he threatened to defund the Office of the High Commissioner, and through that, the other mechanisms. He just didn't know how long that would take. That actually takes a longer period of time than he had to actually strangle, the budgetary process. But there are some things that need to be done in the structures of the UN that make that not as possible. At some time we can talk about that. That's a slightly different topic. But
it's fascinating, and you have so much personal experience to share about it. So I'm glad that you asked, Professor Sikkink. I want to ask one more question now about the CERD that came into the question and answer box, and I'm going to combine it with a few others. So Kate asks, can you share 1 to 2 examples where a CERD petition had a significant impact to push for a government to change its policies? And I'm going to tie that with 2 other questions. So Kate had asked earlier, and Professor Sikkink very well responded, that sometimes citizens might be hesitant to file for a complaint against, and particularly she said a citizen in Karabakh might be hesitant to file for a complaint against Azerbaijan through the CERD because they fear that filing such a complaint may implicitly recognize Azerbaijan's claim to the Karabakh territory. And so combining those 2 dynamics together of the implicit recognition and then also the fact that this might not actually lead to anything, do you have examples of times when it has? And then one more thing that I have personally, I wanted to ask you about the complaint is that in researching it and trying to, work on one, I know it calls for exhaustion of domestic remedies. And I wanted to ask you again, throwing another wrench into the question, is there a way, and I was going to do like precedent research on this, but maybe off the top of your head, is there a way to say that, it's going to take too long to get this through Azerbaijan, or Azerbaijan's not going to seriously consider this claim? Or is there a way to get around the exhaustion of domestic remedies and go straight to the CERD? That was a lot, but if you have
yes, if domestic remedies are going to be totally for naught, I mean, it's the same as any domestic remedies, set of rules. If clearly either it's not available or it would be useless to even try, and you have to make these claims in a credible fashion, then, you can get around it. And I think in this case, you probably can easily make that claim. On the point about...
I've heard that described as the exhaustion or futility of domestic remedies.
That's right.
Futility,
that's right.
I think that's a great phrase to use.
Yeah, the futility of going through that process. The other point about implied recognition is that if it is a situation of illegal occupation, you don't actually have that problem. If it is illegal military or whatever occupation, there's no, by filing a complaint by a person in that territory filing a complaint, against the occupying force. There's no implication that it is a legal occupation. The occupiers that are not lawful, nevertheless, if they have the control over the territory, they have the obligations to treat all within those territories with respect in terms of international human rights law. Ask a Palestinian.
And sorry, did you have 1 to 2 examples of where a CERD petition has had a significant impact to push for a government to change its policies? Either of you?
Well, a petition, it depends on what kind of petition.
I wonder individual complaint, but go ahead. You go for what she said. You interpret it your way.
Individual complaints that, as I've said, they're very few to CERD. And what they have tended to be are things like complaints about denial of employment opportunities by people, migrants, or someone who is
Oh, you got muted again.
Because of their identity, they and the discrimination against them and their identity group, they are denied some right, like an employment right, a job or a promotion or whatever. So they haven't, I would say that they have not been of great significance in the way that I'm sure you're looking for. You might want to, again, look at the individual complaints before the Committee on Civil and Political Rights. Even there, they have had their significance in ways that would not unearth the sovereignty of the country. But they've been things like recognizing the rights of LGBT.
Oh, you're muted again.
Doing this. People who identify under the matrix of LGBT to employment rights, for example, and thereby opening the UN recognition of LGBT in general. So I mean, there've been some very, but except for Article 27, which is the minority rights article in the Civil and Political Rights Covenant. Except for that, I mean, the Civil and Political Rights Covenant is very quintessentially about individual rights. I'm not sure, you're not actually going for that. You're going for something bigger, I think. In that respect, no, but I would say that, and as I've said, we're still in the process of watching how these interstate petitions move through the system, and to what extent they might create some real impact. That having been said, I would say that the times that civil society groups have brought to us through shadow reports an understanding of what's going on within the country that is not evident in the country reports. It can be earth-shattering. Here's a good example from my recent tenure.
Oh, you muted. Oops.
For me, I was one of the rapporteurs recently for China. There was nothing, of course, in the country report that would have been in any way controversial or new information. But through some shadow reports we learned of, and I broke the story about the camps, the detention camps of Uyghurs, and the incredible, lockdown on Xinjiang province that had extraordinary, reach throughout the whole province and on every single Uyghur in the country. Something that we would not have known otherwise. So I think shadow reports are essential to, the CERD members understanding the real situation before us.
Thank you, Professor McDougall. That is so helpful, and really, really reassuring to us who had written a report like that. So thank you both. We're at time, but last final words. Somebody asked, how can we all help the general public? And I mean, I don't think you needed to be a law student to write that report that we did together. So that's maybe one avenue. I can say people can take on. You both said, take every avenue you can, go to the other treaty bodies, do that. So, maybe that's one way to help, but coming from you two, what are last final words of ways you think everybody watching can help, whether they're a lawyer or not, to improve the situation for Armenians around the world?
Well, as to the situation in Azerbaijan, I think that, which is different from Armenians all around the world, but is connected. It's derivative in a way. I think that, the reality is that change, real change, fundamental change in countries always comes from inside the countries. And so it is important to find ways to support and protect those people inside the country and to help them take action. And then bring that out to the international community, because I think that generally, as we discussed, our tools are limited and we know how to pull those levers, but it's when things are going inside the countries, when there is opposition that's open and, taking risk and all of that, unfortunately. But it really comes from inside each country, this kind of change.
I would just say that I completely agree with that. That change mainly comes from internal, but the international community has an essential role to play, not to replace the protagonism of domestic actors, right? But to help protect them, to open space for those actors so they can do their work. And so we've talked about lots of different things people can do. The one thing we haven't talked about, and as I worked for a while on a human rights group on Capitol Hill before I went to graduate school, it actually is useful to talk to your representatives. And people victims used to come all the time to Washington and talk to US representatives. And it was incredible how some of those staff people, especially, and representatives themselves, took up issues. Okay, there was a staff person. There were senators who were very involved in working on the Armenian genocide, for example, and that can make a difference. So
and now you've got a State Department that you can work with. The Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, you know, you ought to be on his speed dial, along with the unit I used to be called, strangely, Labor and Rights. I'm blocking what it's called now.
I think it's called democracy. I think it's called democracy, rights, and labor. Democracy, rights, and labor. Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, that's another place that you ought to put pressure. And the other thing is, you know, I mean, there's a significant voting bloc of Armenians in the US that can wield a certain amount of, you know, recognition from members of Congress. And, you know, you should. That's how we make change in terms of foreign policy. So, yeah.
Thank you. It's inspiring, especially to hear you both speak so much about like specifically what we can do in this context. So thank you for bringing all your expertise to this specific situation and for enlightening all of us here with your knowledge and insight. It's been a privilege for me and an honor to be on this with both of you, to meet you, Professor McDougall, to see you again, Professor Sikkink, and thank you again, everybody, for coming. And Lucy, take it away to wrap it up. Thank you.
Just from the Armenian Bar Association, we want to extend our most sincere gratitude. I think you've demonstrated why we all look back on college so fondly. It's these lessons that we've learned and we will continue to learn. So thank you so much. And we really do hope that the Armenian Bar Association can continue this relationship with you going into the future. So thank you again on behalf of our members and the organization as a whole. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
Bye. Good night. Thanks again, Anoush, for organizing us.
Thank you both.
Yeah. Bye now.
All right. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.